the winter of 1852, on a night when the cold shattered bones and the plantation lay buried under a heavy, suffocating silence, a 28-year-old man named Moses Kane picked up a tool that had humiliated him for 15 years, a cotton hoe that pinned him to the ground from sunrise to sunset every single day, a tool that symbolized slavery, obedience, and a life with no choices at all. Yet that night, it was about to take on a new meaning. Moses had been enslaved since the age of 5, the day his parents were sold away, and he never even understood what family truly meant, growing up amid the shouts of overseers, the crack of whips, and enforced silence. But something inside him never went dark, a mind that listened, analyzed, and had even learned to read in secret. And it was this dangerous combination of physical strength and independent thought that unsettled plantation owners. 10 days before that night, the plantation overseer, a man named Samuel Blake, beat an elderly woman unconscious simply for working too slowly, and then announced loudly that anyone who helped her would suffer the same fate. And right there, Moses stepped forward, not shouting, not pleading, simply standing still and saying, "Enough." And that single word was enough for Blake to attack him with feral violence, breaking his ribs, bruising his body, and leaving him unable to work for days. But before the story continues, if you are inspired by this account and want to hear more real stories drawn from the darkest corners of history, like this video right now, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends, because your support is what keeps these stories alive. Those blows were not just pain, they carried a clear message. If you stay, you will eventually die. If you submit, the violence will never end. And Moses understood that truth in that moment. He had 10 days, and he spent them not like a slave, but like a man planning to survive. Memorizing routes, watching Blake's habits, listening at night, stealing weapons and ammunition, and silently deciding that he would never again be anyone's property. On the night of January 20th, while the plantation slept, Moses entered the overseer's room and lifted that same cotton hoe, the very tool that had humiliated him for years, and with a single strike ended the life of a man who held power over dozens of human beings. Then he lit the fire, not merely to burn a building, but to destroy records, ownership, and the symbols of a system that refused to see him as human. The flames rose, the master's house burned against the darkness, and Moses vanished without looking back, not to hide, but to begin a path with no return. He headed toward mountains the law dared not enter, a place that would either kill you or set you free. And in that moment, no one yet knew that this escaped slave would become a nightmare whose name the American South would whisper in fear for years to come. A story that proved some people take freedom so seriously that they are willing to burn for it, fight for it, and even die for it. And this was only the beginning of a story that would change everything.
Winter had not yet released the mountains of Tennessee when Moses Kane, wounded in body but fully awake in mind, stepped into a world that bore no resemblance to the plantation. The mountains were cold, merciless, and silent, yet just as capable of killing a man as they were of sheltering him. He spent the first days like a wounded animal, hiding in caves, carefully erasing his footprints out of fear, and keeping himself warm at night with the smallest fire possible, because he knew that smoke meant death. Moses had learned that the mountains followed their own law, a law that cared neither for skin color nor for ownership, only for survival. Hunger became his first true enemy. The food he had stolen from the plantation ran out quickly, forcing him to learn how to hunt, build traps, distinguish edible plants from poisonous ones, and treat every bullet like gold. Within those first weeks, he understood that freedom was not simply the absence of chains. Freedom meant that even the smallest mistake could be the end. Slave hunters soon entered the region, armed men who did not know the mountains but fed on blood and fear, and Moses was forced to think more than he ran. He changed routes constantly, deliberately left false signs, and used elevation to observe, something years of plantation labor had never taught him, but his intelligence made up for. At night, he heard the dogs and judged the distance, sometimes so close that he held his breath and waited for them to pass. Slowly, the mountains transformed from a refuge into a weapon. Steep slopes, narrow paths, and caves known only to him gave him an advantage.
During those days, the first signs of his legend began to form, whispers among escaped slaves and free black communities about a man who had burned a plantation and survived. Moses was not yet seeking war, but he knew that if he remained alone, he would eventually be killed. He needed a network, eyes and ears, people who, like him, had nothing left to lose. Weeks passed, until one night, in the bone-freezing cold, he saw the shadow of a man barely able to walk, pushed to the edge of death by hunger. His name was Jacob, an escaped slave who had heard that the mountains offered refuge and had spoken Moses' name like a prayer. Their meeting was not a coincidence, it was the beginning of something larger. Two fugitives who realized that survival alone was not enough. For the first time, Moses became responsible for another life and understood that freedom only has meaning when you can defend it. That night, beside a dim fire, without heroic speeches and without grand promises, only through silence and exchanged glances, a decision was made that the mountains would no longer be just a hiding place. They could become a base, a place that did not consume escaped slaves, but transformed them. Moses did not yet know that this path would lead to a 7-year war, but he knew he was no longer a simple fugitive. He had stepped onto a road with no return, and from that moment on, the mountains bore witness to a slow but dangerous transformation, one that deepened with every night he survived. Moses and Jacob gradually learned how to move without being seen, how to read sounds and tell real danger from deception, how to divide food and make decisions in silence because too many words meant mistakes. Jacob's presence was more than companionship. It was proof that Moses' path was no longer individual and that every step forward would carry greater consequences. The mountains, which until yesterday had been nothing more than a place to escape, were now slowly becoming a map in Moses' mind, a map for survival, for resistance, and for the day when hiding would no longer be enough.
As the months passed, the mountains were no longer just a place for Moses and Jacob to survive, but had become a ruthless school that delivered a new lesson every day, lessons paid for with mistakes, blood, or death. They learned that time moved differently in the mountains, the days felt shorter and nights stretched endlessly, and that every sound could mean rescue or warning. Moses gradually realized that endurance required more than individual skill. He had to understand how others thought, how slave hunters moved, and what the enemy feared most. Slowly, he secured specific routes, created hidden caches for supplies, and found positions from which the lower valleys could be watched without being seen. Jacob, who at first had only wanted to stay alive, had now become a second set of eyes and ears, someone who sensed danger early and sometimes reacted before Moses spoke. Together they formed unwritten rules: no fires during the day, no footprints without purpose, no sound when silence was safer, and no trust without testing. During this time, others began to appear, not all at once and not loudly, but like shadows emerging from the forest. Escaped slaves, free black men in danger of being captured again, and even men running from the law or from debt. Moses did not accept any of them easily, because he knew one mistake could destroy everything. He watched them closely, tested their patience, and judged whether they could endure silence. The mountains were not for the strong alone, but for those who knew how to wait. With each new arrival, the weight of responsibility grew heavier, and Moses was forced to accept something he had never sought: leadership. He did not give orders, he made decisions, and gradually others learned to trust those decisions because survival was the result. Slave hunters began to realize they were no longer dealing with a lone fugitive. Signs became more confusing, traps more precise, and attacks more sudden. On some nights, the sound of a gunshot echoed from the distance, followed by a heavy silence that meant someone had not returned. Fear slowly changed direction. It was no longer only the fugitives who were afraid, but also those who came to capture them, now stepping forward with hesitation. Moses understood that fear could be a weapon if used correctly. He did not allow violence without reason, but when it became necessary, he acted quickly and decisively, because in the mountains, hesitation meant death. The legend that had once been only a whisper now took a clearer shape. The story of a man who had not only escaped, but had turned the mountains into his territory. Moses did not see himself as a hero. He was simply a man who refused to feel chains again. Yet every step he took carried him further from a fugitive and closer to something far more dangerous. The mountains were now filled with eyes, paths, and signs that only his group understood, and that meant the game had changed. They were no longer only hiding. They were ready, if necessary, to stand their ground. And that readiness marked the beginning of a stage from which there would be no return. As the group expanded, the mountains entered a new phase. They were no longer just a place to hide, but had become a living network where every movement carried meaning and every decision could change everyone's fate. Moses understood that greater numbers did not automatically mean greater strength unless there was order. And order in the mountains was not created through shouting or force, but through trust, shared fear, and a single purpose. He began to divide responsibilities, not formally or openly, but naturally and gradually. One watched the routes, one understood supplies, one had sharper ears for sound, and another saw better at night. Everyone found their place, because the mountains did not tolerate repeated mistakes. At the same time, secret connections formed in the lowlands. Enslaved people still on plantations brought news, reported the paths of slave hunters, and passed along whispers, which meant Moses's group was no longer blind. The first ambush was small but calculated, not meant to kill, but to intimidate. A hunter who believed he knew the mountains was surrounded at night, disarmed, and released with a clear message: "This is not your land." That incident had more impact than any bloody confrontation because word spread quickly and planted doubt in the minds of those who hunted humans for money. Moses knew that violence without purpose destroyed everything, but controlled fear could prevent war. Still, not everything went according to plan. One wrong night, one extra sound, and one brief clash were enough for blood to be spilled and for a line that had once been psychological to become real. After that, no one in the group lived with illusions anymore. They were no longer just fugitives. They had entered a path with no return. The mountains responded, pursuits grew heavier, bounties increased, and Moses's name shifted from rumor to official threat. Yet within that pressure, something new formed, something that had not existed before. Deep trust among people who knew that if they did not stand together, they would be destroyed one by one. Moses slept less at night, not from fear, but from thought, because every decision he made could save several lives or end them. He was no longer fighting only for his own freedom, but for the meaning freedom had taken on within the mountains. The group slowly learned when to be seen and when to disappear, when to strike and when to wait, and this dangerous balance pushed them closer from prey to predator. The legend was no longer just a story, it was taking shape, and those living in the lowlands began to understand a bitter truth. The mountains were no longer safe because someone lived there who had nothing left to lose, and that realization changed how people behaved. Some no longer dared to come close, some altered their routes, and others spent their nights awake in fear. Moses's name gradually became a warning sign, not because of the size of his group, but because of his unpredictability. No one knew exactly where he was, when he would strike, or whether an attack was coming at all, and that uncertainty was heavier than any blow. The group learned that sometimes the greatest victory was remaining unseen, and sometimes the only true sign of power was the silence left behind. The mountains, once merely a means of escape, had now become part of their identity, a place where decisions were made and destinies were shaped. Moses knew that with every step he took, the distance between him and his former life grew greater, but there was no longer any path back, because this time he was no longer running from something. He was defending something whose meaning he was only just beginning to understand.
Having crossed a point where return was no longer possible, Moses's group entered a phase that was no longer defined solely by survival, but by initiative and boldness. The mountains were now not only a refuge, but a testing ground, a place where every decision had to be calculated quickly, precisely, and without mercy. Moses understood that if they were going to stay alive, they had to change the rules of the game, not merely react to them. The first sign of this shift was an attack whose target was not people, but the system itself. A caravan transporting enslaved people from distant plantations toward the south was trapped along one of the narrow mountain routes, not with shouting and chaos, but with silence, encirclement, and a swift strike. Chains were broken, captives were freed, and the guards, before they fully understood what was happening, either fled or abandoned their weapons. This time, the message was clear. The mountains were not just a place to hide, they were a place where chains could be shattered. News of the attack spread like fire, igniting a dangerous hope in the hearts of those who until then had waited only to be sold or to die. At the same time, fear deepened on the other side. Slave traders, hunters, and plantation owners realized that something was changing, something that could not be solved with a few armed men. Moses knew that every success carried a price. Pursuits expanded, more forces were mobilized, and pressure rose from every direction. But the group was no longer the small, scattered band it once had been. They had learned how to move through darkness, how to strike, and how to disappear before any response could form. With every operation, cohesion grew stronger and trust deeper, because their lives were now tightly bound together. Moses felt the weight of responsibility more than ever. One wrong decision could destroy not only his group, but the fragile hope that had just begun to take shape. Night after night, he planned, traced routes in his mind, and tried to think one step ahead of the enemy, because the enemy was no longer just hunters, but an entire system that could not tolerate the existence of such resistance. The mountains were not calm, but they were alive, and this new life, dangerous and unstable, was taking on a new meaning. Moses was no longer merely the leader of a group of fugitives. He was becoming a symbol against which others measured themselves, asking whether it was possible to stand, whether it was possible to fight, and whether freedom was only a dream or something worth paying for. Every attack, every disappearance, and every chain that was broken pushed him further from his past and shaped a future that no one, not even Moses himself, could predict. Yet the signs were clear. The network that had formed in the mountains could no longer be ignored, and reactions from the lowlands grew harsher and more organized. Forces that had once been scattered now advanced with plans and coordination, and the scope of the pursuit expanded beyond a single region. Moses knew this was only the beginning of a harsher stage, a stage in which every small victory would create a greater enemy. Gradually, the group learned that success was not measured only by freeing chains, but by surviving afterward. The mountains showed a harsher face with each passing day. Decisions grew heavier, yet what had been formed could no longer be easily erased, because this resistance was no longer just a reaction, but a conscious choice, a choice that had permanently changed the course of all their lives.
As the scope of the operations expanded, reactions were no longer local or scattered, and the mountains entered a phase that carried the scent of war. Moses quickly understood that the freedom they had gained was now drawing the attention of powers unaccustomed to being challenged. Local governors, large landowners, and even paramilitary forces paid to preserve their version of order. Pressure from the lowlands did not merely increase, it became smarter. Routes were sealed off, informants grew more active, and traps became more complex. Moses was forced to move beyond small tactics and think in terms of broader coordination, something like an invisible war in which voices were fewer and decisions far heavier. The group learned that information was more valuable than weapons. Knowing the timing of caravan movements, changes in troop routes, and internal divisions within the enemy mattered as much as a rifle. During this period, the first serious confrontation occurred, not a lightning strike, but a direct clash that showed the game had entered a new stage. Several were wounded, one was killed, and a heavy silence followed that felt unlike anything before. This time, the costs were real and undeniable. Moses spent his nights thinking more than ever, not only about the next move, but about a simple and merciless question: how far can one go without breaking something inside? He knew that every step forward reduced the possibility of retreat, yet retreat no longer had any meaning. The mountains were now filled with signs of conflict, paths that were safe and paths that meant death, faces that could be trusted and faces that had to be feared. The group was forced to choose more harshly, decide more quickly, and accept that not everyone would survive. Within this bitter reality, something shifted. Fear changed from a paralyzing feeling into a guided force. Moses realized that if he could not control this fear, it would destroy both him and the others. He began to speak less and observe more, listening to the signals the mountains offered and reading silences louder than any sound. The legend no longer circulated only among slaves and fugitives, but had reached the ears of those who held real power, and that meant the stage ahead was no longer about escape or even resistance, but about survival against a force determined to make an example. Moses knew that if he failed, that failure would not only end his life, but would become a message to everyone who had dared to think about freedom. That awareness multiplied the weight of responsibility and turned every decision into a choice between life, death, and meaning, a choice that no longer concerned only him. Every glance around, every exhausted face, and every fresh wound reminded him that the path they had chosen would not be without cost, and that no victory comes without sacrifice. The mountains felt heavier at night, as if they themselves were waiting to see how long this resistance would last and what price would be paid. Moses felt that time was no longer moving in anyone's favor, and that every moment of hesitation could change fate. Gradually, the group accepted that some decisions have no right or wrong answers, only consequences, and that one must live with those consequences. This bitter understanding made them more mature and yet more alone, because it was no longer possible to simply think about the past or take comfort in the future. Everything was compressed into the present, a present filled with danger, doubt, and a responsibility that grew heavier each day, revealing that the road ahead was the hardest stage they had faced so far.
As the ring of encirclement tightened, the mountains were no longer merely a field of scattered clashes, but became the stage for a direct confrontation with central power. Forces now deployed not to hunt a few fugitives, but to break a pattern. Moses understood that this time the enemy was not simply seeking victory, but aiming to make an example, to show what fate awaited anyone who chose such a path. Routes became unsafe one by one, secure locations were exposed, and the mountains that had once been a refuge were now filled with shadows where it was impossible to tell friend from foe. Moses was forced to make decisions he had avoided until then, dividing forces, abandoning certain positions, and even sacrificing hard-won gains. The group learned that sometimes retreat was not defeat, but the only way to stay alive. In these conditions, betrayal entered the equation like an invisible specter. Information reached the enemy sooner than expected, movements were exposed, and signs appeared that not all dangers came from outside. Moses became more cautious than ever, not out of blind distrust, but from a bitter understanding that pressure can break any human being. He realized that leadership at this stage meant choosing between bad and worse, and that no decision would be without pain. The first real encirclement was brief but warning, an exchange of fire, a calculated withdrawal, and a silence afterward heavier than any sound. This time, everyone understood that the next stage could be the final one. Moses thought about the future less than ever and clung more tightly to the present, because the future taking shape was far too uncertain. He knew that if he made a mistake, it would not only destroy him, but also erase the meaning this resistance had come to hold for others. The mountains now bore witness to decisions in which emotion had no place, only survival, time, and calculation. The group gradually accepted that the end of this path might not be victory in the classical sense, but that even standing until the final moment could carry meaning. The legend that had once begun with escape had now reached the threshold of a final confrontation, and Moses knew that whatever lay ahead would define his fate not only as a man, but as a symbol of resistance, a symbol that no longer belonged only to him. Every glance from the lowlands, every rumor passed from mouth to mouth, and every new force sent into the mountains showed that the story had entered a stage that could no longer be stopped. The group felt the distance between decision and consequence shrinking, and that mistakes no longer allowed room for correction. Moses saw changes in some faces. Fear had deepened in their eyes, yet at the same time a cold calm had taken shape, the calm that comes from accepting the worst possible outcome. At night, the mountains seemed to breathe more heavily, as if they themselves were waiting for the next blow. No one knew what tomorrow would bring, but everyone knew that tomorrow would not resemble yesterday. This silent awareness held the group together in a shared quiet, a silence born not of weakness, but of readiness. Moses now knew that if this road reached its end, whatever that end might be, it would no longer be merely a failed escape or a simple victory, but a moment in which history would decide how to reckon with this name, these mountains, and this resistance.
This time, the encirclement formed more completely and more ruthlessly than ever before, not only through paths and valleys, but through time, exhaustion, and scarcity. Moses understood that the enemy was no longer in a hurry. They had learned to wait, to cut off resources, and to let the mountains do the work for them. Supplies dwindled, lines of communication went silent one by one, and with each passing day, the psychological pressure grew heavier than the physical strain. The group was no longer facing only bullets and traps, but fatigue, doubt, and questions that quietly circled in everyone's mind at night. Moses knew that in such conditions, the most dangerous enemy was despair, something that could collapse everything without a single shot being fired. He tried to keep a rhythm, simplify decisions, and prevent fear from spreading as chaos within the group, but the reality was that time was working against them. The first separation occurred. A few who could no longer endure decided to leave, not out of betrayal, but out of exhaustion. Moses did not stop them, because he knew that holding people by force is the beginning of collapse. Their departure was a silent blow, not to numbers, but to the collective spirit. The mountains were now quieter than ever, and that very silence was the heaviest sign of danger. On one of the nights, the encirclement was not broken, but tightened. A brief exchange of fire, limited casualties, and a retreat that felt more like being pushed back than a choice. After that, everyone understood there was no longer any room for error. For the first time, Moses seriously thought about the end, not as defeat or victory, but as the inevitable result of a path taken. He knew that every next decision would either buy time or end everything. The mountains were no longer mere witnesses. It was as if they themselves had become part of the battle, cold, slopes, and darkness working against both sides, though the fugitives had less left to lose. The group reached a point where every movement felt like the final one, and this feeling brought a bitter clarity. Moses saw fear give way to focus, to a calm that arrives only when there is nothing left to hide. The legend was now in danger of collapse, not because of the enemy, but because of reality itself. Yet right on the edge of breaking, something changed, a decision born not of blind hope, but of full acceptance of the situation. Moses realized that this stage might not be about victory, but about meaning, about showing that even under total encirclement, a human being can still choose. This awareness shaped the path of the next episode, a path that would either end everything or change it in an unpredictable way. From that moment on, Moses' view of his surroundings shifted. He was no longer searching for an immediate escape, but for a moment that could disrupt the balance. He understood that sometimes breaking an encirclement does not mean physical passage, but changing the equation. The group gradually sensed this shift, not through words, but through behavior. Decisions became sharper, movements more calculated, and silences deeper. Everyone knew that what lay ahead would not be simple, yet this knowledge created a cold, emotionless readiness. The mountains seemed to hold their breath and wait, not for an ending, but for the moment when fate would choose its course. In the heart of that heavy silence, Moses understood that even if this path ended in destruction, what had taken shape could no longer be erased, because a decision had been made, and some decisions do not disappear, even with defeat.
The decision made in the heart of the encirclement was unlike any of the decisions before it, not for escape, not for a quick victory, but to break the pattern the enemy was relying on. Moses understood that if the end of this path was to be written, it could not be the ending the enemy had already prepared. He did not draw up a plan based on chance, but on understanding the enemy, their patience, and the weakness that had grown out of that very patience. The encirclement had dragged on, and its length had worn down the focus of the opposing forces. Moses saw this exhaustion and knew the moment to intervene had arrived. The group was divided into several smaller units, not for a major assault, but to create confusion, sounds from different directions, signs meant to occupy the enemy's mind. Nothing was random. Even the silences were calculated. The mountains once again played their role, with paths only they knew, shadows dissolving into darkness, and distances that did not exist on any map. For the first time in weeks, the enemy was forced to react, not according to plan, but out of anxiety. The exchange of fire was brief and scattered, yet its impact was deep. The encirclement cracked, not physically, but mentally. Moses knew the crack might be small, but it was enough to disrupt the balance. The group moved without celebration and without excitement, because nothing was finished yet. Every step could be the last. In the midst of this, a hard choice surfaced again. Not everyone could move together. Moses was forced to accept that to save the path, he had to leave a part of himself behind. This was the heaviest decision he had made up to that point, not because of danger, but because of the meaning it carried. The mountains bore witness to this separation, a separation without shouting or protest, only looks and silence. The enemy realized something had changed, but too late. An encirclement meant to slowly end everything had now turned into an unstable factor itself. In the heart of this movement, Moses understood that this might be the last time he made such a choice. But if it was the last, it had to be the right one. The legend that had been built now stood at a point where it would either collapse or take on a new form. Nothing was certain, except that the previous path no longer existed. Episode 9 was not an ending, but the moment when the story moved beyond survival and entered a realm where meaning mattered more than outcome. From that moment on, the group's behavior changed. There was no longer any rush, and every movement was carried out with full awareness, as if everyone had accepted that this part of the journey was no place for haste or excitement. Silences grew longer, and glances conveyed words that no longer needed to be spoken. Moses felt that the weight of the decision he had made rested not only on his own shoulders, but on the entire mountain. Every distant sound, every flickering light in the night, and every suspicious movement became part of an equation that had to be solved without error. The group knew the enemy was still powerful, but no longer certain, and that doubt was the greatest change that had occurred. The mountains were now witnessing a movement not for survival, but for redefining destiny. In the midst of this calm advance, Moses realized that even if everything were lost tomorrow, the moment they had forced the enemy to react could never be erased. This awareness brought a cold calm, a calm born not of certainty, but of full acceptance of consequences. Episode 9 did not close with this understanding, but remained open with it, because what lay ahead was no longer merely the continuation of a story, but a point at which history would decide how it would remember it.
The moment Moses reached was unlike any he had faced before. It held no surge of excitement and resembled no heroic battle, but instead felt calm, heavy, and inevitable. The encirclement had taken its final form, not wider, but tighter, a space where any movement could change everything at once. Moses knew there was no room left for trial and error, because the enemy had reached the same conclusion. This time, neither side was waiting for the other to make a mistake. All were waiting for the instant when the final decision would be made. The group had grown smaller, more exhausted, yet more focused than ever. Their eyes no longer asked questions, they only confirmed. The mountains were silent, an unnatural silence that felt like the pause before the final blow. Moses reviewed the last routes, not on the ground but in his mind, and understood that this time the choice was no longer simply between living and dying, but between how to die and how to live. The enemy advanced, not in haste but with confidence, believing the game had already been won. The exchange of fire began, brief, brutal, and without time to think. Sounds echoed through the mountains, and then silence returned, a silence that this time carried the scent of an ending. Moses did not look back, not out of courage, but because there was nothing left to return to. He knew that whatever happened in this moment would no longer concern him alone. This was the point where the story ceased to belong to individuals and was handed over to history. The mountains bore witness to the final confrontation, not as a refuge, but as a stage where everything converged: fear, hope, violence, and meaning. When the sounds faded, no one knew exactly who had won, because what had broken was not merely an encirclement or a group, but an idea that had endured for years. Episode 10 was the moment of the story's explosion, the point at which the path could no longer be altered, and everything that remained would be only the consequence of this moment. But the consequences did not reveal themselves immediately. At first there was only silence and smoke, and a heavy weight pressing on every chest. Moses did not know how many of the enemy had withdrawn, or how many of his own were still standing, but he knew that something irreversible had occurred. This clash was unlike the earlier ones that could be contained in reports or rumors. A boundary had been crossed that could not easily be repaired. It was as if the mountains had witnessed the crossing of an invisible line, beyond which nothing would ever be the same. Moses felt that even if he himself did not pass beyond this moment, the decision he had made would survive. Eyes were still on him, not to receive orders, but to understand whether meaning still existed. He realized that at this point, leadership no longer meant guiding others, but fully accepting responsibility for the consequences. The enemy, too, understood that this battle was not merely about eliminating a group or a man, but about breaking or failing to break an idea. That realization made the space after the clash even heavier. No cries of victory were heard, no clear signs of defeat appeared, only a raw reality that would have to be lived with. In the heart of that heavy silence, Moses understood that the story had reached a point where it could no longer be defined by bullets or plans. From here on, whatever happened would remain in memory, not only in the ground. Episode 10 was not the end of the road, but the moment when everything was laid bare, when it became clear that however this path continued, it would never again be simple, and no one, not even the enemy, could pretend that this moment had never occurred.
The end of this journey did not arrive with a loud, dramatic scene, nor with a clear answer to who had won. Instead, it concluded with something deeper, more lasting, and more unsettling: the trace that remained. After the final confrontation, the mountains slowly returned to a surface-level calm, but that calm was no longer the same. Forces withdrew, some to rebuild, some to report, and some simply to understand that they had encountered something that could not be erased so easily. Moses' name may no longer have been spoken every day, but the impact of his decisions lived on in the enemy's behavior, in their caution, in altered routes, and in the fear that still lingered in the air. There was no official declaration of victory, no document stating where this resistance had truly ended, but history is not always written through records alone. Sometimes it is written through pauses, through shifts in behavior, and through things that no longer repeat themselves. Enslaved people who heard the stories now knew that escape did not always mean destruction. Those in power, too, realized that order was not as absolute or unbreakable as they had believed. Moses may have stood at the center of this story, but its ending did not belong to him alone. What remained was a question, not an answer. If a human being can still choose in the worst possible conditions, is the system truly victorious? This story did not claim that resistance always leads to freedom, but it proved that surrender is not the only option. The mountains fell silent again, but this time their silence did not come from forgetting, it came from knowing that something had broken, something had changed, and something had permanently slipped out of control. The story of Moses Kane may end here, but its trace does not. Some stories are not meant to conclude, they are meant to endure, to raise questions, and to resurface each time history repeats itself. This ending was not a point, but a line that showed that even in the darkest chapters, choice still exists, and it is that choice that shapes history. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this video. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, subscribe to the channel right now, like the video, and share your thoughts with us in the comments.